Picture this. You are a Praetorian guard in Rome, and the year is far into the empire's reign. Your hand shakes as screams echo from the imperial chambers. You've protected several emperors, survived endless battles, watched men die in every way you can imagine, but nothing has prepared you for serving a young boy who makes grown senators cry with fear. The heavy doors swing open. The emperor appears wearing silk robes that cost more than a soldier's yearly pay. His face is covered with makeup, neck hung with twisted holy symbols, but it's his eyes that chill your blood, innocent cruelty that only a child can have. Someone who has never been told no, never learned that other people feel pain. Behind him, servants carry bloody silk and shattered jewelry, items once worn by people who thought noble birth would keep them safe. You've learned that screaming ends eventually. The quiet that follows is worse. What you don't know is that this boy will become the most wicked ruler who ever lived. His short rule will show more planned cruelty than emperors who ruled for many years. By the time the guards choose they've had enough, Roman civilization itself will be falling apart. But this nightmare gets worse, much worse. Before diving into these lost stories of survival and pain, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. His real name was Varius Avatus Bassianus, but the world would know him as Elagabalus, priest of the Syrian sun god. Born in a distant year, carrying poisoned blood that had built in royal families for many generations. His mother, Julia, had endless ambition and no moral limits. Syria, where he was raised, shocked traditional Romans. Ancient cults practiced holy prostitution, gender-changing rituals, human sacrifice hidden as religious faith. The boy learned that as God's chosen one, normal rules didn't apply. That pleasure was a sacred order. That pain inflicted on others was worship. What truly shaped the monster was the complete absence of anyone willing to say no. From his earliest memories, people competed to fulfill his every whim. Servants cleaned up tantrums without complaint. Tutors praised cruel games as natural leadership. Family saw his intelligence and beauty as tools for political advantage. By his early years, tears brought him anything. Later, violence brought faster results. When Rome's throne fell vacant, he'd mastered using humans as entertainment objects. However, the conspiracy that placed him on the throne reveals something truly chilling about the people who enabled his rise to power. Caracalla's assassination created opportunity. The current emperor Macrinus was unpopular, having cut soldier pay while increasing luxury. Julia Soaemias spread rumors that her son was Caracalla's illegitimate child, making him the rightful heir. The lie was obvious. Elagabalus resembled no one. Timelines didn't match. But soldiers wanting better pay chose belief over truth. Julia Soaemias had stolen temple gold, buying loyalty from key commanders. Here's what will chill your blood. This wasn't just about placing a teenager on the throne. Julia Soaemias had observed her son's developing character, his casual cruelty and calculating mind. She knew exactly what monster she was unleashing. Letters to supporters reveal a woman who saw her son's depravity as a political asset, not a problem. She promised commanders free plunder, assured priests their god would rule Rome, told merchants about eliminated regulations, but never mentioned what the boy wanted, what he dreamed during Syrian temple nights, watching sacrifice rituals and imagining grander ceremonies with himself at the center. The Battle of Antioch was less a military confrontation than a political collapse. When Macrinus arrived with his loyal troops, he discovered that most of his eastern legions had already declared for the pretender. The soldiers who remained faithful were quickly overwhelmed by superior bribery. Macrinus died fleeing toward Rome, his head cut off and sent to the teenage boy who now claimed imperial power. Elagabalus received the news while performing mourning rituals in the temple of his sun god. Witnesses described a scene that should have been triumphant, but instead felt deeply unsettling. The boy, dressed in silk robes, mixing imperial purple with religious gold, smiled when shown his predecessor's severed head. But it wasn't the smile of a victorious general. It was the pleased expression of a child who had just received an especially entertaining toy. His first act as emperor was to order the heads of Macrinus's supporters displayed around the temple. His second was to demand that captured prisoners be brought before him for personal judgment. What happened next established the pattern that would define his reign. Instead of quick executions or merciful pardons, Elagabalus created elaborate games where prisoners could earn freedom by participating in increasingly degrading competitions. The games began innocently enough. Captured officers were forced to race around the temple complex while carrying heavy stones. Winners received freedom and gold, losers faced execution. But as the boy emperor watched these proceedings, something darker awakened in his eyes. He began adding new rules, modifications that had nothing to do with military tradition and everything to do with his growing fascination with human humiliation. Soon, the races included obstacles that forced participants to crawl through mud mixed with animal waste. Then came requirements that losers submit to physical punishments that grew more creative and more intimate with each iteration. The Syrian priests encouraged these innovations as expressions of religious creativity rather than recognizing them as signs of developing sadism. Those who resisted these new entertainments simply vanished, not killed in dramatic executions, but quietly removed and never mentioned again. However, this was only the beginning. The journey to Rome would give Elagabalus time to experiment with absolute power and develop appetites that would make his Syrian games seem like children's entertainment. The march to Rome became a moving carnival of depravity, shocking hardened soldiers. Elagabalus traveled in an elaborate litter, carried by slaves chosen for beauty, not strength. He discovered that beautiful people increased his divine perfection, treating human attractiveness as a resource to collect and consume. Each city provided tribute, their most beautiful young citizens, not hostages, not volunteers, but human ornaments for his traveling pleasure palace. Boys and girls barely adolescent, torn from families for the emperor's entertainment. What happened during travel nights was whispered in letters between governors. The emperor's tent, larger than houses, was divided into chambers serving different purposes. Religious shrines where he performed Syrian rituals, mixed with creative additions. Bedrooms where he entertained himself with beautiful captives. Most disturbing were chambers for educational sessions. The young emperor gathered tributes, lecturing about new roles in divine service. Not speeches about duty, detailed explanations of what would be expected intimately, emotionally, spiritually, upon reaching Rome. A boy with no governance training providing comprehensive instruction in organized degradation. Those who disappointed him or showed resistance didn't simply vanish. They were quietly removed from the traveling court and never mentioned again. The imperial guards learned that not asking questions about empty tents or reduced tribute numbers was itself a survival strategy. But what awaited in Rome would make the journey's horrors seem like preparation exercises. The Palatine Palace had echoed with Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius for centuries. Within months of Elagabalus's arrival, it became unrecognizable. His first priority wasn't governing, but redesigning living space for divine ceremonies. Traditional Roman religious spaces were austere, inspiring respect and reverence. Elagabalus demolished them, replacing them with chambers mixing Syrian temple architecture with his innovations. New spaces featured altars carved with explicit scenes, walls painted with shocking imagery, specialized furniture whose purpose became clear during private rituals. Palace staff were divided into new categories, having nothing to do with traditional duties. Some were selected for physical attractiveness and assigned ceremonial service. Others were chosen for discretion, maintaining specialized equipment arriving from Eastern craftsmen. A third group cleaned up after entertainments and disposed of embarrassing evidence. Most concerning were servants who simply disappeared after direct service assignments, not formal executions, no crimes or trials, simply there one day, gone the next, quarters reassigned as if they'd never existed. But here's what made the palace truly horrifying. He began incorporating his experiments into official state functions, forcing senators and foreign ambassadors to witness ceremonies that mixed governmental business with activities that had no precedent in Roman history. A typical audience with the emperor now included entertainment that made experienced politicians physically ill. Foreign diplomats who had come to negotiate trade agreements found themselves watching performances that involved palace slaves in scenarios too graphic for official records. Senators who arrived expecting traditional meetings about legislation were instead required to participate in religious ceremonies, where they had to choose between compromising their dignity or facing accusations of disrespecting the emperor's divine authority. The most disturbing aspect was how systematically it was all organized. These weren't spontaneous outbursts of madness, but carefully planned events with specific purposes. Elagabalus was using intimate humiliation as a tool of political control, breaking down the psychological resistance of Rome's elite by forcing them to participate in or witness activities that violated their deepest moral convictions. Each ceremony was designed to test the limits of what people would accept rather than face imperial displeasure. The emperor would introduce new elements gradually, watching carefully to see who showed signs of resistance and who demonstrated complete submission. Those who passed his tests were rewarded with gold, political advancement, and relief from future testing. Those who failed simply disappeared, replaced by more compliant alternatives. However, the emperor's appetite for innovation meant that even successful participants could never feel safe. Elagabalus was constantly developing new forms of entertainment, new ways to test loyalty, new methods of demonstrating his absolute power over the bodies and souls of his subjects. But something snapped when Elagabalus decided that his current entertainment options weren't providing sufficient stimulation. The boy emperor had exhausted the possibilities offered by palace slaves and courtiers. He needed fresh victims with higher stakes. His attention turned to Rome's most noble families and their children. Palace agents were dispatched throughout Rome to identify the most beautiful sons and daughters of the nobility, creating lists that read like catalogs of potential victims, detailed physical descriptions, information about family relationships that could be exploited for emotional leverage, and assessments of which families could be safely victimized. The first families to receive imperial invitations understood immediately that these weren't requests, but commands disguised as honors. Their children were being summoned to participate in religious ceremonies at the palace, with a clear implication that refusal would result in accusations of disrespecting the emperor's divine authority. But accepting meant sending their sons and daughters into an environment where previous participants had emerged traumatized or hadn't emerged at all. Several senatorial families attempted to protect their children by sending them away from Rome or arranging marriages that would make them unavailable for imperial service. But Elagabalus had anticipated such resistance and declared that avoiding religious duty was itself a crime against the state. Imperial guards were dispatched to bring back fleeing children, and hasty marriages were annulled by imperial decree. The psychological pressure on Rome's elite became unbearable, as they faced impossible choices between protecting their children and preserving their own lives. Some families chose exile, abandoning their property rather than subjecting their sons and daughters to whatever the emperor had planned. Others attempted to bargain, offering gold or political support in exchange for exemptions that Elagabalus rarely granted. But perhaps most tragic were the families who submitted, convincing themselves that cooperation would protect them from worse fates, or that their children's suffering was a necessary sacrifice for family survival. These parents delivered their own sons and daughters to palace ceremonies, then lived with the knowledge of what they had enabled when traumatized children returned home, changed forever. Most disturbing was how completely normal this had become for the imperial court. New arrivals were quickly educated by surviving staff about the emperor's expectations and the consequences of resistance. An informal system developed where experienced courtiers would brief newcomers about which behaviors were required, which were forbidden, and which were recommended for advancement. The emperor's appetite escalated beyond individual cases to group ceremonies involving dozens of young participants at once. These events were planned with military efficiency, requiring extensive preparation, specialized equipment, and careful coordination between palace staff who had become expert at facilitating the emperor's most extreme fantasies. Palace records from this period, discovered centuries later in archives that imperial successors tried to destroy, reveal the systematic nature of these operations: lists of participants organized by age and physical characteristics, schedules for ceremonies planned weeks in advance, orders for equipment that make clear the activities planned for each event, medical preparations for treating participants afterward. Most chilling are reports filed by palace observers assigned to document the emperor's innovations for future reference. These accounts, written in clinical language that barely conceals their author's horror, describe ceremonies that push the boundaries of human cruelty and intimate perversion, far beyond anything recorded in previous imperial reigns. However, Elagabalus had made a critical error in his systematic degradation of Rome's elite. By victimizing the children of powerful families, he had created enemies with both the motivation and resources to destroy him. The same senators who had submitted to personal humiliation in palace ceremonies drew the line at watching their own sons and daughters suffer similar fates. But the boy emperor sealed his own fate when he announced plans for his most ambitious ceremony yet, a week-long festival that would involve hundreds of participants from across the empire. Designed to demonstrate the universal reach of his divine authority and satisfy appetites that had grown beyond anything the palace could provide, word of the planned festival reached potential victims throughout the Roman world, creating the catalyst that conspirators needed to unite opposition. Families who had submitted to previous demands realized that the emperor's appetites were escalating beyond any possibility of satisfaction. Military commanders understood that such extreme behavior would eventually provoke rebellions that could tear the empire apart. Even palace staff who had enabled previous ceremonies began to understand that they were participants in something that threatened the foundation of civilized society. The end came with shocking suddenness. One morning, Elagabalus was conducting rituals when Praetorian guards entered and announced that he was no longer emperor. The boy, who had terrorized Rome for years, faced his final moments with the same petulant disbelief that had characterized his entire reign. According to witnesses, Elagabalus's last words were not pleas for mercy or expressions of regret, but complaints that his divine ceremonies were being interrupted. Even facing death, he seemed incapable of understanding that his victims were human beings rather than objects for his entertainment. The guards killed him quickly, along with his mother Julia Soamius, then dragged their bodies through Rome's streets before throwing them into the Tiber River. But the story doesn't end with the emperor's death, because the legacy of his reign would haunt Rome for generations. The systematic degradation he had practiced created trauma that affected entire families and political networks. Children who had survived his ceremonies grew into adults whose capacity for normal relationships had been permanently damaged. Senators who had participated in imperial entertainments carried shame that influenced their political decisions for the rest of their careers. The new emperor, Alexander Severus, spent years trying to restore traditional Roman values and erase evidence of his predecessor's reign. Palace chambers were demolished and rebuilt. Records were destroyed or hidden in archives. Staff members who had served Elagabalus were reassigned to distant provinces, where their knowledge of imperial secrets couldn't contaminate the new administration. Yet the trauma lingered in ways that shaped Roman culture for decades. Families became more protective of their children, understanding that imperial favor could be more dangerous than imperial displeasure. The military developed new protocols for evaluating potential emperors. Religious practices changed, as traditional Romans became suspicious of Eastern influences that had enabled such systematic perversion. Most tragically, many of Elagabalus's victims never recovered from their experiences. Historical records contain references to former palace slaves who spent the rest of their lives in religious retreat, seeking spiritual healing for trauma that had no precedent in human experience. Noble families affected by imperial ceremonies often withdrew from public life entirely, unable to participate in social activities that reminded them of their degradation. As we reach the end of this journey into one of history's darkest chapters, we must confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of absolute power and human evil. Elagabalus wasn't unique because of his youth or Eastern background. He was unique because circumstances allowed his worst impulses to develop without constraint, creating a monster whose appetites grew through satisfaction rather than being satisfied by it. Today, in our own era of concentrated power and hidden networks of exploitation, the story of Elagabalus reminds us that the capacity for systematic evil hasn't disappeared from human nature. It waits in the shadows of every generation, looking for opportunities to emerge when circumstances align to provide both motivation and means. The children who suffered in palace ceremonies long ago have long since turned to dust, but their suffering echoes through history as a reminder that some forms of evil are too destructive to be forgotten. We remember their pain not to sensationalize it, but to honor their humanity and ensure that the systems which enabled their victimization are recognized and resisted whenever they emerge. The boy emperor who thought himself a god learned too late that even absolute power cannot protect those who mistake cruelty for strength and perversion for divinity. His death in Rome's streets served justice not just for his specific crimes, but for the larger crime of treating human beings as expendable objects in service of personal appetite. The most depraved emperor in history was indeed only a teenager when he began his reign of terror, but age proved no barrier to systematic cruelty when combined with unlimited power and complete absence of moral constraint. His legacy stands as eternal testimony to the human capacity for both unimaginable evil and ultimate resistance to that evil's dominion. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.